2 years after the Battle of Yavin, Galactic City, formerly Coruscant Undercity. Thyla waited patiently at the rendezvous. Well, he was sure he meant patiently, but he couldn't help lightly kicking his foot every so often, or rolling his neck when it got stiff. He thought back to how Fox would have gone ballistic if he saw him getting all informal on the job, as he called it.
You always were a nasty piece of work,
he grunted. All these years, and he still thought so lowly of the commander. But who wouldn't? He, like most of his brothers, had always preferred Thorn.
Times have changed.
It was hot and loud in the Undercity. At least that had stayed the same. Thyla was impressed that no matter who was in charge, Republic or Empire, neither was very effective at making this place any more appealing than Bantha. He laughed under his helmet and stopped himself, playfully flicked his head.
Come on, soldier. Snap to.
Speeders screeched past. Steam flooded the air, and a cacophony of alien chatter surrounded him. But through all of it, no sign of Davin. Thyla thumbed the handle of his blaster rifle.
Nervous, soldier? Must be getting old,
he said to himself. He tapped out a Bith band tune on the stock of his rifle to ease his anxiety. A trick Letta had taught him that he was still thankful for. He gave a big, dumb, toothy smile as he thought about her, of all the things they were going to do when they got home. Thyla! Davin, as punctual as ever, sauntered up with a Togruta that was so far out of his league that she may as well have been in a different atmosphere. And a small Twi'lek girl hiding behind his leg. Thyla raised a finger, pulled out a small gadget from his belt, and placed it on a barrel next to him. It lit up and blinked blue. Ah, jammer, Davin pointed.
Yep. We want to start tightening this operation. The last thing we want is a flock of imperials down here.
Thyla ushered them over with a flick of his head, and let his gaze sit on the young girl before turning back to Davin.
Alright, so I take it it's the woman and the girl this time.
Thyla had been running these rescue ops ever since the fall. It was all simple enough. Davin would contact Letta, Letta would give him a location, then Thyla would rendezvous to do his part to send whatever family or caravan of anti-imperials down the trail. The trail. A lovely little network Letta had set up for this very op. It was like a series of segmented escort checkpoints. One trooper would escort up to a certain point, then they'd shift change with another. The idea was to divert suspicion, and so far, it had worked like a charm. Davin shook his head. All three of us.
All three?
Thyla cocked an eyebrow. Yep, I'm done with this gig. Scares the crap out of me. Might go to Renvar or something. Join the spice trade. When he was younger, Thyla would have cringed at that. Hell, he used to bust spice peddlers when he worked the beat. But at this point in time, high morals like that didn't really get you far. He glanced at the girl again as she slinked further behind Davin. Thyla crouched down to her eye level and looked back up at him.
What's with the kid? Seems awfully jumpy.
Davin waved his hand. Oh, you know the deal. Parents were rebel sympathizers. The authorities decided to re-educate them. Thyla sighed and looked back to the girl.
She didn't say it, did she?
Davin's carefree attitude faltered. Yes. Flamers. Thyla sighed, now realizing why she was hiding from him, the man in heavily worn red and white armor. Though the paint was scratched and the white was closer to grey now with decades worth of carbon scoring, He was sure it didn't matter to the little girl. He knew that all she saw was a stormtrooper. He lifted off his helmet and set it down in front of her. "Tyler, do you really want to do this now?" Davin wasn't impressed. "Trust me, the last thing you want is an uncooperative person on an op like this." He tried to catch the little girl's gaze, sort of having to sway his head to meet it. "It's all right. I'm not Empire. I'm a clone, see? Like in the Republic days. Did your mummy and daddy ever tell you about clones?" She peered out a little bit and gave a sheepish nod. It was like she was scared Thyla was going to eat her. But that was all he needed. He nodded back and put on his helmet.
Does she speak?
"Mute as a brick," Davin shrugged. The path to the next rendezvous took them through many of Coruscant's sleaziest ghettos. Sure, this whole thing was to avoid Imperials. But down here, Thyla's biggest worry was slavers. He remembered one time back during the war where he and his brothers had to detain a Zygerian. The last thing he wanted was to have to deal with that sort of nightmare again. Thyla made sure to take point, regularly looking over his shoulder, checking to see that everyone was close behind. The little girl still kept her distance. And for some reason, that made his stomach twist. He furrowed his brow, thankful that they couldn't see past his helmet. Glory doesn't matter, he'd always told himself. There's just the mission. Though he'd never admit it, he missed the old days. Back then, he wasn't blind to the fact that the Coruscant Guard got a bad name thanks to its foolish commander. But that never changed things on the smaller scale. On his beat, Thyla and his brothers could often stop and have a friendly chat with the civilians they had come to know by name. Maybe even every once in a while, turn a blind eye to the more minor offences. The other guardsmen on the surface would look down on them for that. Probably yammer on about loyalty to the Chancellor, or some crap. Thyla shrugged. Maybe he was just bred wrong. Hours had passed. The rendezvous wasn't far now, and it wasn't long until he saw the next escort. A scrawny little man with bits of knockoff Beskar held together with fraying straps, and all of it crudely painted red and white. Thyla rolled his eyes. Another one of Letter's ideas, a sort of uniform based off of his armor. Thyla never hated the idea. It just reminded him of his brothers, so it always made him twinge. The next escort was standing out in the open, leaning against some sort of storage cube. He was mid-yawn. He seemed relaxed. Relaxed? Thyla felt his gut drop. He had a bad feeling about this. Something was off. He turned back to Davin.
Wait here. Let me go and check this out.
He pointed for them to stay in the relative dark of the alley that they had come. Thyla breathed deep and made his way.
Trooper!
He started. The man shot up when he saw the old clone, looking over his shoulder as subtly as he could. He was jittery. Never trust a man with the jitters.
Is everything alright, son?
He asked. Of course, sir. Everything's fine. So if you just want to hand over the rebels, we can move along. Thyla glared.
Rebels?
The young man was sweating now. Thyla was easily a head taller than him, and was now within grabbing range. Finally, the man pulled the blaster and pressed the barrel against Thyla's chest. Just stay right there, he sputtered. He was now frantically looking all around him, eyes darting about. Thyla leaned into the blaster.
Whoever you're really waiting for seems late to me.
There was a squeak as the man's bargain bin blaster trigger squeezed. Before it fired, Thyla grabbed his wrist, flung it out of the way, and held him close, with his free hand grabbing the man's throat.
You imperial scum.
The man looked past Thyla, back to the alley where Davin and the girls were. A devilish grin now crawled along his face.
Gotcha,
he croaked. Suddenly, blaster fire rang out and red bolts showered the area. Thyla's eyes widened. In a flash, he swung the man around and crouched behind him, the traitor now working as his meat shield. In seconds, he was filled with holes, and Thyla shifted with the corpse taking the punishment.
Damn!
He spat.
Oh, where the hell are they coming from?
He peered over the dead man's shoulder and saw stormtroopers flooding the alley where Davin and the girls were.
No!
He cried. Davin and the Togruta turned to face them and raised their hands in surrender. Thyla went to scream for them to duck and cover instead, but it was too late. In a matter of seconds, they were cut down. But out of the corner of his eye, he saw the Twi'lek girl running for cover, disappearing down a separate alley. He had to move. If he stayed here, they would be all over him in seconds. He had to get out of here, find the girl, and contact Letta. Let her know that everything had just fallen apart. He peered over the dead man's shoulder again. The stormtroopers were still confined to the alley, but they were moving up fast. It was only for a few more seconds that Thyla would have the benefit of enfilade fire. Awkwardly, he propped the barrel of his blaster rifle against the corpse's back and squeezed the trigger. In seconds, the automatic weapon burned a hole through the man's back and burst out of his belly. Thyla pushed the blaster barrel deeper into the new hole until it poked out of his front. He could now stand and fired with the body propped up on his gun, acting like some grotesque riot shield. Even through his helmet, he could smell the dead man's burning hair and searing flesh as the stormtroopers screamed and fired blindly at the old clone, their blaster fire in vain as it was eaten up by the meat shield. But Thyla was having to blind fire back as well. For a second he thought, crap, this is never going to work. But lucky for him, clones are better at spray and pray than stormtroopers. It was over in seconds. Once the last stormtrooper fell, Thyla used his boot to kick the traitor's body off his blaster. He looked down the opposing alley where the girl had run.
Now, where are you?
Thyla moved down slowly, carefully. He knew that where there were a handful of stormtroopers, there'd be far more on the way. They may not be able to hit a target to save their lives, but they made up for that in numbers. He had to find the girl and contact Letta. He moved through the sweaty crowds until he came to another opening.
Please be alright.
He whispered to himself. He had been running ops like this for years now, but whenever he did, he always found himself worrying about the kids. As he escorted countless families, he always made sure to doubly protect the kids. Yet another example of him being bred wrong, he thought. Of course, that was what it had to be. After a while, he came to a bustling market. Old womp rats hung from grills. The smell of fried food filled the air. The younger part of him, still wanting to book all of these health code violations, he scanned the faces of the crowd, trying to see the girl.
Come on, kid, where are you?
Finally, he saw his little Twi'lek, crouched next to some sort of music stand, knees hugged to her chest. They locked eyes, and she threw herself to her feet and ran.
Damn it, no!
Thyla yelled after her. He tried to push past the uncooperative, uncaring crowd. This was Coruscant, after all. No one cared about child runaways down here. Thyla had to vault over stands just to keep up with her. Even through everything, the girl impressed him. She was a fast little one. He was in arm's reach now.
Stop it! It's okay, just...
Finally, he grabbed her and pulled her close, the both of them tumbling, but the old clone refused to let go. She squirmed and fought, trying to scratch at him, but that wouldn't do much against the plastoid. He reached for his helmet and pulled it off again. Look, see? It's me. I'm not a stormtrooper. It's okay. It's just me. The girl paused for a moment and stopped fighting as she saw him. Though her chest still rose and fell, Thyla thinking that he could almost see her heart pumping through her skin, like in those old cartoon holovids for children. He slid his helmet back on and eased off her.
It's okay, kid. It's okay. But we're going to have to go, alright?
He couldn't imagine what this little girl had been through, but he tried to understand. Species are all aged differently, but to his eye, she looked like she had to be at least 5 or 6. Too young, he thought. She got up slowly and moved over to another stall and crouched beside it, covering her ears and tucking her knees again. Thyla went over to her and crouched as well.
Kid, really, it's not safe. We've got to go.
No response. He had seen this before. She was going into some sort of shock. Her thoughts were becoming singular as everything set in. Not sure of what to do, Thyla toyed with the idea of carrying her, but if she struggled, they wouldn't get very far. He looked around the market, at the spice peddlers and the slaves selling their bodies for credits, until he spied a small tropical-looking plant on one of the traders' desks. An idea popped into his head. It was a long shot, but it was worth the try.
Hey, have you ever heard of Felucia?
The young girl looked up for a second, maybe confusion or curiosity on her face.
You see, far out there, and I mean far, there is a place where none of this stuff matters. There's no rebellion, there's no empire, there's no war.
He was making it up as he went. He had no idea what the planet's state was nowadays. When he last heard of it, it was General Sakura's battleground. But the young girl's eyes had seemed to light up just a little bit. Maybe he could give her some sort of small hope.
See,
He took a breath to remember the holovids he saw so long ago.
it's a place where the sky is a warm green. There are glittering flowers, as big as trees, as big as buildings, and giant beasts that roam swamplands, completely untouched by war.
A fleeting smirk went across the girl's face as she imagined that. Thyla felt his heart grow warm when he saw that. He smiled too.
Now, if you come with me, my friend Letta and I will take you there, and you won't have to ever see an Imperial or a blaster ever again.
The girl paused, and then quickly reached out and hugged him tightly.
Okay. Let's...
She cut him off by tightening her embrace.
Hey, it's okay. It's okay.
He rubbed her back and let her weep a little into his shoulder.
I'm gonna carry you now. Is that alright?
She nodded. He held her close and stood, activating his wrist communicator with his free hand.
Letta, do you copy?
I'm here. Are you all right? You missed your mark-off. I've been worried sick. The radio sparked up, and the voice of his wife came through.
Yeah, I'm alright.
He replied.
But we were compromised. The guy at the meet was Imperial. Bantha fought sold us out.
Davin?
Dead. And the Togruta too. I've got the Twilight Girl, and I'm now in a market on
He looked around for some sort of identifying markings.
sub-level Q.
The radio went silent for a second as Letta started typing away at the terminal on her end.
All right.
She came back.
Nearby there should be an old museum. Cut through there, and on the other side you should find external access junction 4C. You got that? 4C. I'll be waiting there in a dynamic class freighter.
Thyla felt himself get a little excited when she said that.
Dynamic class? You mean the Ebonhawk? I thought you sold it.
Letta gave a verbal shrug and chuckled.
Yeah, well, what can I say? You've got an eye for the antiques. I'll give you that much. Took this long to repair, we may as well use it.
Thyla punched the air a little with his free hand. But snapping back to the situation at hand, he repeated.
External access junction 4C. Cut through the museum. Copy.
Copy.
Letta confirmed.
And I love you.
She ended the comm. Thyla moved the girl to a more comfortable position and started on their way.
Alright, kid. Let's get you out of here.
It was a longer march to the museum than Thyla had expected. When Letta had given him the coordinates, he had groaned when he'd seen that his wife's idea of nearby was actually about an hour's walk. Either way, they had gotten there in the end. The building was busted up and run down in more ways than one. The neon lights long dead, and the windows and doors boarded up. It didn't look pre-Empire, but it was definitely old. Thyla went to put the girl down, but as he did, he felt her nuzzle into him. She had fallen asleep. He froze, not entirely sure what to do. He sighed and straightened up. After all, who was he to wake her up? He heard the sounds of boots marching around the corner behind him. The Imperials had caught up. Quickly, he ducked inside the old museum and gently slid the old door shut behind him, hoping that the Imperials didn't see.
Alright, what are we working with?
He whispered as he turned to face the dark interior. Tacky old statues of the Chancellor made him roll his eyes. He popped the girl down and went to look for the exit. When Zana opened her eyes, she was surprised to see that she wasn't in the market anymore. Looking around, she saw the dark, expansive interior of the museum. It was awesome to her. In all her life, she'd only ever heard of statues like this being on the surface city. But here, in this place, though decrepit and falling to bits, here some were. Magnificent statues. She saw Thyla off against the far wall, tracing his hands down it, trying to find a gap. A door? Maybe. She awkwardly climbed to her feet and went to look around, but made sure to stay where Thyla could see her. All these beautiful sets and dioramas woke a more childish part of herself, a part she had to force down ever since they came for her parents and cut out her tongue. She was lucky that they'd only gone that far. She was young, sure, but she knew what Tylex were used for. She turned her attention back to the statues. They were at least 12 feet tall and were coloured by the use of various differently pigmented stones. She wondered how long it would have taken to carve these. There were so many of them, the most common of which being that of a man. The plaques told her that he was called Palpatine, a saviour of the core systems and a uniter of the galaxy. The name meant nothing to her, but the large hooded figure made her insides feel cold. She didn't like it. Finally, she came to a display of 5 statues, all clad in pristine white armour. But they weren't stormtroopers. She looked back to Thyla. They looked like a cross between him and something more menacing. Their plaque read, "In honor of the Grand Army of the Republic, heroes of the galaxy, defenders against the treasonous Jedi." Jedi? The word had no meaning to her. Well, it sounded almost like something her parents would have made up in a bedtime story. They had told her in passing about clones, but never Jedi. It was such a foreign term. She looked back up at the statues, that feeling of awe refusing to go away. She had barely noticed when Thyla reappeared by her side.
All right, kid. I found our exit. Let's get out of here.
Zana looked at Thyla, the statues, and back again. Their Phase 2 armor was so clean. They were like shining knights, great warriors of myth. Thyla, on the other hand, was heavily battle-damaged. His armor a mishmash of generations. But his helmet, still his original trusty Phase 1. He didn't look like a warrior of myth. His armor was held together in places by rags and an almost gunslinger-style throw over his shoulders. They stared at each other, Thyla growing confused by the way that she stared at his helmet. It had been so long since someone had looked at him like that. She pointed to the crudely drawn yellow markings on his helmet that stood out from the old red and white. He shifted in place, not sure of whether or not they had time for this. But the way that, for the first time, in the very short time that he had known her, the girl's eyes seemed to brighten, full of something better. Better. Thyla wished for the better times, the better places. Just the better. He relented and took off his helmet one last time, pointing to the markings. Letta, that lady I was talking to on the comm? Well, she's my... He thought of a way of saying it without making a little child cringe. She's my special person. She's my family now that my brothers are all gone. He looked to the statues, sadness filling the air around him, until he tried to shake it away. It's because of her that I'm not as old as I should be, and that I never betrayed... He trailed off. Zana gave an understanding look, but Thyla had no idea what she understood. He pointed to the helmet again. She's Pantoran, you see. These little yellow markings, well, they're kind of like my family crest now. I get them from her, and this is how I honor her. Zana reached for the helmet, and reluctantly, Thyla let her take it. She slid it on and made little finger guns with her hands, playfully running about the museum, making blaster sounds with her mouth. The feeling twisting around inside Thyla's chest was bittersweet. Seeing her play was like looking into a time capsule. Back when he and his brothers were heroes, of when his brothers were still alive. If he could, he would have been happy to stay in this moment forever. Watching her play, reminding him of all those times. He smiled. Suddenly, there was a crack of a thermal detonator explosion, and the statues disintegrated into stone confetti. Thyla, in a panic, jumped for Zana, shielding her from the blast and letting the stones ping off his plastoid. He looked to the hole that was blown in the wall, and through it, Imperials swarmed in like hungry dogs licking their lips. Thyla picked up Zana and ran for the exit, blaster fire raining down on either side of them. He dove through the door at the far end of the museum and ran down the following flight of stairs.
Get him!
And,
Rebel scum!
being shouted after him by the stormtroopers. Letta! He barked into the communicator. Are you at the external access junction? I'm inbound and I've got imps on my ass!
I'm here, hurry!
Thyla vaulted over the railing and dropped down the rest of the way between the stairs to get some sort of a lead on the stormtroopers breathing down his neck. It was a long drop, and as he landed, he felt his ankle crunch against his own weight. He fell, and Zana flew out of his hands, skittering across the ground to the open door that led to the access junction. Through it, he could see Letta and the Ebon Hawk. "Ugh! Come on!" He barked and forced himself through the pain, got to his feet and swept Zana up in his arms and ran for the freighter. But he had done a real number on his ankle, and he didn't get far before he collapsed again. Blast! He hissed. He looked back to the door, knowing that any second a swarm of stormtroopers were about to pour through. If Letta waited for him, they'd have enough time to get in position and shred the Ebon Hawk with heavy blaster fire. So without hesitation, he grabbed Zana by the scruff of her shirt and threw her as far as he could towards Letta. The little girl bounced a little and slid towards the Pantoran. Letta called out, "Thyla, what are you doing? Come on!" He gave her a solemn look that said more than words ever could. Tears began to stream down Letta's face as the horror set in. Everything was falling apart so quickly, too quickly. She nodded and grabbed Zana, but the little girl on some level understood what was going on. She tried to wriggle free and fight back, tried to run back to Thyla's side. Thyla, seeing how this could all just turn to crap in seconds, raised his blaster and shot at the ground in front of Zana's feet. "Get back, girl!" Trying to sound scary, but his own pain making his words far more guttural as he held back tears. "You were right! I'm a stormtrooper! Come near me and I'll kill you! I'll blast your little head off!" Zana, still wearing Thyla's helmet, squealed and ran back to Letta, letting the Pantoran sweep her up in her arms and rush back into the Ebon Hawk. She looked back to her husband as she hurriedly closed the ramp, trying to make a mental image of his face, remembering all the little details, all his beautiful features, the man she fell in love with, the man that had saved her during the purge, and the man that she had saved from that mind-burning chip. Thyla looked back too, no tears, but eyes watering. As fast as he could, he turned away and rushed back to the staircase, blaster in hand. He swung open the door, propped himself against the wall, and aimed up at the gap between the stairs, at the writhing mass of stormtroopers that were descending. He took a breath, everything flashing before him, the situation pressing down. Finally, he squeezed the trigger. "All right, you imperial scum."